Good.
All right. So, I don't really know how.
Microphone, Julian.
Oh yeah. Guess we gotta hold this. First question: was Jeffrey Epstein murdered? I hope he actually watches through this just so that he could see how this goes.
I'm into history and all sorts of things, but
A,
not him.
a big maybe. Okay. I don't know. I'm trying to find this link and it's somewhere. It's definitely somewhere. Oh my goodness. I really hope this is here and I'm not just looking for nothing.
That's fine.
While I'm looking for this, could you give me a little bit of history about the Pharis Farm that might have been left out of these documents?
Well, I knew Mr. Pharis his last 2 years, and Mr. Pharis was a very unique gentleman when I knew him. He was a very visionary. He had a vision when he was teaching school as a young man that he wanted that property to be a historical teaching facility. And he had a whole vision, and he had a timeline, and I was at the end of his timeline. He felt that people needed to be connected to the soil, they needed to know where their food came from, and they needed to know their history. And foremost of anything he was a teacher. Always a teacher. From the beginning to the end, he was a teacher. And he planned this meticulously from day one to even to when he picked out that property to when he ended that property.
So, is the farm still a thing? Is it like it's still an active farm, or is it more of a historical site now?
I believe that they are doing a little bit of both, and they're trying to get it to be more of an up and running historic site. His vision was that 210 would eventually be 4-lane and go to Chicago. It was part of his sales pitch. So it made it location, location, location is the old saying. So he thought it would be a perfect location if 210 ever was 4-lane and went to Chicago, that it would just be a day trip off. But he also picked that property because of the terraces, because of the hills up and down. He felt the hills up and down, you got twice as much property than a flat piece. He picked a corner piece because you got more property, more road frontage, so you got more visibility. He really meticulously planned. He originally started with this, that he had hoped that the federal government would take it on as a federal historic site. They declined. Then he went to the state and asked them to take it on as a historical site. They eventually declined. He had tried the local historical groups and they declined. And then he had come to Clay County, and I was Clay County Historic Sites Director at the time. And we were able to, through a lot of paperwork and help from the lawyers and lots of visionaries on our side, be able to take over the property. And actually he died the next day after we got it completed.
Well, hey, at least you got to see it partially started.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. All right, so I got the question pulled up here. One thing I learned was it was built after the Revolutionary War. Do all things like this require a budget? If so, how large?
Oh, Mr. Pharis had the option. He was a kind of unique man on the fact that if you gave him a nickel, he could squeeze a quarter out of it. He was able to be very frugal with his money, very deliberate with his money, and he left an endowment of $200,000 at the time, which was not enough for a property for government to manage. But he also thought of a way, as a teacher, he was always giving back and always thinking, because teachers have to give their kids material usually. You see, today teachers are buying books and paper and pencils and things for their students. He was able to look at it in a larger vision, such when he did terraces, to show people how agriculture changed. He went to different manufacturers and said, this is a perfect chance for you to show your new terrace machine. And he would have them, and this is a story he told me, that he had different farm days. So they actually paid for his terraces. And his idea was they could show people how to make terraces, show your machinery, but he had somebody else pay for the machinery and the labor to put it in. And then he would tell me, now, every time you do an event, he said, always serve lunch, because people will come if you serve lunch. So always serve lunch. And throughout the years, I met people, Farm Bureau, anytime there was a agricultural event, Don and his wife were there. And when they were there, they were always in the front row, and the joke was that all over unanimously they would say, he would call up and say, make his reservation and say, now you're serving lunch, right? Because if you want to have a good crowd, you got to serve lunch.
Always. Yeah.
Always serve lunch.
All right, next thing. Again, I really hope I'm reading these right questions. I'm not
That's fine.
messing this whole thing up because there's a lot of them. I don't know if I should go through all of them.
Do whatever. I'm actually. He was a very unique man. People change. You know, he was always teaching, and one of the things he would do is tell me, "What did you learn today? You're never too old to learn." And that was always a question. So even when I would go out to see him, I had to think, okay, now I'm going to get the question, what did I learn today? Because he would not let you go until you had a question, an answer to his question. But every 5 years, your priorities change. And his main priority was to make sure that property was a historic site. But when I met him, he knew his time was limited. So he was very focused on what he wanted to get done.
Huh, that's interesting. There are a lot of small and slightly intense elements when it comes to let alone making a movie. Why are there so many people involved in this film? I don't know if that's a question you can answer.
I think it's because I don't know the people involved, but I would think because Mr. Pharis left a lot of priorities, a lot of different things that could be used. The vision could be large, depending on the imagination and the people that you draw in. And he was really a good person to figure out collaborators to bring in. And anybody that he brought in, so Mr. Mose, he came out from Mose Heating. So Donald would do his research on everything. So he'd done his research, and he would tell me, okay, I realized for the county it would be difficult to, because it's an old antebellum house. He goes, I guess we need a new furnace. Got to have a new furnace and air conditioning to keep things.
Maybe.
Yeah, so people will come in, and it's just the right temperature, right humidity. So I came out there one day, and there is Mr. Mose and his van out there. And Donald had talked to him, and he says, and Mr. Mose was an older man at the time. Donald's comment to everybody is, well, I checked you out. You appear to be a good guy. I know all about your parents, so I know what kind of upbringing you were. So you're a good man for the project.
Gone through your whole history, man.
He checked on everything and everyone.
That's amazing.
He was amazing. He was interesting.
Yeah. What were the first steps in like starting this whole project of making this a historic site?
He started as a young man when he was a VOAG teacher in Ray County. He'd found a cabin, but he had always thought that he needed to expand his teaching. So he didn't pick the first property he saw. He looked and looked and looked until he found the right property, and he had the complete vision in his head. And he eventually found this property. He eventually found a log cabin and moved there. And he and his wife were very intense. They were doing school tours and agritourism long before agritourism became kind of a thing. They were teaching, always teaching.
I thought of something, but it just immediately left my head.
Happens to be all the time.
Were there slaves on the property at all?
That would have been with Daniel Bell, and I don't know. Daniel Bell would have been before Mr. Harris. You know, he would have been one of the original owners. Mr. Pharis, there are 2 rooms above that were sealed off. There's lots of gossip and rumors and whatever to those sealed rooms. Clay County historic sites at that time historic sites are always running on a shoestring. So one of the things they did was usually had somebody live on site as on-site security. So when they had someone that they didn't really have enough money to increase their salary, they provided a place to live. And there were 2 rooms that had been sealed off upstairs. So he had was working on that, so that could be a security place upstairs. And whether that was servants, whether those are children, there's lots of stories, but I'm never sure the truth of it.
What do you mean sealed off? Like you physically just can't go in there, or like it's just locked?
The stairway to those 2 rooms was taken out.
Oh.
It was blocked off from the other bedroom upstairs.
Will we ever know the true secrets of what's behind those doors?
No. I did one time when they did some repair. I think it was probably when they were doing the furnace.
Mm-hmm.
They had taken the boards off the windows. And so I did go up in, because I wanted to see, but I wanted to make sure it was nice and light.
Ooh, juicy.
2 abandoned rooms that hadn't been, there wasn't anything in them. They were just 2 old rooms that had plaster on it. So one could be kind of a living room, kitchenette, and one could be a bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
It was, you were looking for something exciting, but there was disappointing.
I was expecting Tiger King, and all I got was just 2 empty rooms.
Yeah.
What's like special about Pharis Farm? Was it like the farm itself, or was it more like a story of like this family and maybe this man, Donald Pharis, just trying to get it declared a historic site?
It's not as much. He was the impulse and the idea and the visionary to it, but what he was, it is agriculture. Mm-hmm. It is how agriculture plays a part in everyone's life. And he had this drive and this passion and this vision from the day one that we needed to teach, had to teach. He was always teaching something, and he was always learning. When I knew him, he was blind except for just this little corner of his eye. So he would look his eye up to see it. But he had a memory when it came to his bills. He'd have you sit and read his bills to you, and as soon as you read them, he could recite those bills back to you.
Wow.
He was, and then he would call me, and he would say, he goes, "Miss Fest." And I'd say, "Yes, Mr. Pharis, what do you need?" He says, "I need you to get out here right now. I've got something really important to tell you." And I said, "Wait, can it wait?" "Nope, got to be today. Got to be this morning." And I said, "Okay." So I got out there, and then he'd tell me whatever was on his next checklist of his things to do, and then he'd say, "Well, you need to leave now, because NPR, National Public Radio," he says, "it's going to be on in a few minutes. I need my sandwich. I need my lunch. I need you to be out of the house. Don't come back to the house. Go check the sheep and the cattle and make sure the gate's shut." That was the same scenario we went through every time.
Every day.
Yeah.
That's pretty great.
But he was big in the sheep and had cattle, and he had some crops, and he did lease part of it out. We talked about, and he would talk about, okay, I went somewhere and I saw this. Would that help the Clay County be part of the historic sites? One of them was the lane. Mm-hmm. Right, it is a long lane. And the original lane, when I started, I said, it is a traffic hazard. Myself in a vehicle, it is a traffic hazard. You cannot get a school bus in or out of that. So the next time I came out, here he had somebody out there with a bulldozer and rock, and he was working to make sure that entryway, and there would be a parking lot. Because I said, if we're going to invite people, we have to have a place for them to park. Yeah. So it's like a checklist. Each time, another checklist. Yeah.
So he's making sure just to go through, make as easy as possible for people to recognize this place and make sure that they knew exactly how to get there, where it was, and
yes.
Make sure it's perfect. Make it as easy as it could to get it transitioned over.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there anything special about the house in particular?
The house is a very typical antebellum house. I can't think of the house itself. It's got a staircase. It was not a real expensive house, but it was one of the antebellum houses. So the windows are designed so if you open it up, the air naturally flows and circulates through the houses. So even on a very hot day under the trees, it was quite cool in the inside. It kind of has a little winding stairway. It was not a mansion, probably, like you think of the big Gone with the Wind mansion. It wasn't like that. So it was added on. The kitchen was updated. But Mr. Pharis was very frugal, so anytime that he had an update, it was as limited as he could get it to be up. And one day I was there, and he'd been working on the shower had clogged. So he was working on it, and I could see him. They had dug outside, and I said, that kind of looks like the wrong color PVC pipe to me. And he goes, no, but it's cheaper. And but I don't think, he goes, never mind. And I said, okay, whatever. And the next time I came out, he says, you might not want to go in the bathroom. And I go, why? And he says, because there's a black snake that crawled up the drain, and he's at the bottom of the shower now, and somebody has to come and get him out.
It's like, oh.
And I said, I can get the snake. So I got the snake, and when we put grates and redid part of the plumbing.
You were just there like, I got it. Don't worry, guys. All good now.
It's a black snake, so I said, good to know. So I was glad to know that he told me that before I went in there. Those kind of surprises, even though and he liked me. He told me right up front. He says, well, I checked you out. And I said, I bet you did. And he says, yeah. He says, you're a farm girl then. So he says, some of these things shouldn't bother you. So he'd always have me go check the sheep and check the cattle and make sure everything looked like it was supposed to look, or walk the fences. Because at that stage, he wasn't able to do that.
Yeah. Well, are there any updates on the Pharis Farm now that could interest someone watching this?
I have not been to the Pharis Farm in several years, so that would belong to the Friends of the Pharis Farm. I know that they are actively working on preserving and his vision.
Documenting all of it, just putting it all together.
He was quite the character. That we talked about the circulation through the house. He would talk about how he thought about. He put great energy and thought into spending any of his money, because it was always anything he could put back into that fund for the long-term preservation of the Pharis property, for an endowment to go with the property, because things break and you need repair. His wife Laura decided one day, she said, it gets pretty hot out here. I think I need a fan. And so she talked him into it. So he went to Excelsior Springs, and they told him they could sell it to him on credit. Well, he didn't do credit, but he did do layaway. So they picked out the fan they wanted, or she wanted, because he didn't think they needed a fan. And they waited all summer, and they paid on the layaway. And at the end of summer, the fan was paid off. And then he said, well, we've lived the whole summer without a fan. He says, I think I just need my money back. He said, I don't need a fan.
Just give me it all back.
Just give it all back. Because he said that'll give him so much more money to put back into the endowment.
Well, I've reached the end of my questions that I've just got written down here. I think the final thing is, do you think this? Do you think that Mr. Pharis, do you think it would be where do you think the farm and all the thing just going on right now, do you think that it would be around if he didn't put his all into it, if he didn't sacrifice all of his time and effort into this?
No. And it wasn't just him, it was his wife Laura too. Laura is you see Donald because he is the one that pushed it, but behind him was Laura, his wife. He actually had two wives. Both wives died of breast cancer. And but Laura was also behind him and helped him. We were out there at one time. We were just talking about Laura, and he was a man of his times. So he says, you think I would have thought better, because I picked two wives and both of them had breast cancer. And he said, well, that's something. He goes, that's something that we can't really pick, Mr. Pharis. And then he said, was telling us that both wives had a college education, which is really unusual, which I was surprised at. And Laura had worked for a municipality or a county. She had, maybe clerk of court or something. She had a
background with that.
She had a background with numbers. So we were discussing with him about that was pretty unique and rare for as old as he was, that both wives had an education. And he looked at my ex-husband and told him that. He says, well, the only kind of woman to have is an educated woman. And he said, yeah. And he says, yeah. And he says, well, Mr. Pharis, did they work off the farm after they were married? And you have to remember, he was a man of his times at that time. He was 96 years old. And he says, nope. He said, I got more than enough work here for any one woman at any one time. And they need to stay home and work. And then we laughed at him, and then he kind of stopped a minute, and he goes, well, he says, Mr. Pharis, he said, if everybody was that a belief, he said, Gieselle wouldn't be out here at your beck and call. And he sat for a minute and goes, well, yeah. He says, I do have one exception for every rule that I make. So he was quite the character. I know. He would have me read his bills to him sometime. One time we were reading bills, and he'd gotten a bill from his lawyer, Wayne Coleman.
Yeah.
And he was not a happy camper. He thought Wayne had overcharged him. And so he says, Saturday morning, you're coming with me to the lawyer. And I said, I am? And he says, yeah. And he could only see out of this corner. And I said, he goes, well, I got a car. And I said, oh, you're not driving. So we get to Mr. Coleman's office. I get him, and we take him, and we go over to Mr. Coleman's office. And Wayne had a big grin on his face. And Mr. Pharis sits there, and he says, well, before we start, we need to discuss this bill, because I think it's just a little high.
Just a tiny bit.
And Wayne had this big grin on his face, and he kind of winks in my direction. And Mr. Pharis, he recited the bill.
Wow.
To him. And Wayne says, well, he's looking at the bill, and he looks at me, and he goes, yeah, that's the bill. Mr. Pharis says, well, I think that's just a little too high. So Wayne sat there for a minute, and he said, well, Mr. Pharis, you have crops to sell, right? Yep. You have cattle to sell, right? Yep. You have sheep to sell, right? Yep.
Wow.
Okay. And you have hay to sell, right? Yep. Okay. He says, those are your commodities, correct? Mr. Pharis says, yeah. Yeah, those are my commodities. That's how you make a living. And then he says, well, Wayne said, Mr. Pharis, my commodity is time. So you pay for as I would pay for your commodity to put food on my table. You pay for my commodity, which is my time, so I could put food on my table. So he sat there for a minute. He sat there, and you could see that he was thinking, because he had his walking stick, and he'd tap it when he was thinking. And then it says, well, okay, from now on, he says, she talks for me because she talks faster, and so that way I expect a cheaper bill next time. He was quite the character. He was always thinking, and he always wanted to bring children to the farm. He wanted to bring parents. He could see so many things that farm had the capability. The only thing it needed was imagination, and it needed some kind of entity to give it direction. He had really, really hoped that it would be the state of Missouri. He thought that it had, to him, he thought it had more importance than Watkins Mill. He thought it had definitely more importance than Jesse James. And he had worked very diligently all these years to collect farm machinery, farm pieces, old equipment, because even though times had changed, those were the very foundation that we did it for agriculture, and he thought that was very important to come back and that we should be teaching our kids. Fresh air and different types. Public safety was probably not one of his best. He had a flatbed hay wagon where he put kids on, and they'd bounce along in the tractor. But those also, if you talk to anybody that actually knew Mr. Pharis as a young kid that was out there, those are memories that are indelible to him.
Yeah.
They would go out to the log cabin, and they would explain about life in the log cabin. And people would come out here. That really was an element of faith and hard work for people to think that they're giving up their families, a town or East Coast or neighbors. When you're out there, you're all alone. And just doing the little log cabin and what it took to feed people, clothe people. His vision was amazing. Anytime they went to a farm auction, anytime there was a farm auction, he'd go. He wouldn't go at the beginning. He'd go at the end. He'd go at the end because that's when bidders got tired.
Mm-hmm.
So if they left, usually at auctions, there was something large they wanted, and the auctioneer would put different pieces in there. So he'd walk up and say, well, I see you wanted like for example, the tractor, but you got this box of tools. Are you going to use those tools? If you're not, I want them for my historic site.
Yeah.
And he would collect different pieces or different machinery. Anytime he could get anything, he would do that. Because that was constantly on his mind. It never left his mind. I think when he went to sleep, that was his last thought in the day. Mm-hmm. When he woke up, I think that was his first thought. How he could make that property an educational site for not just now, but for the future. And he also looked at income streams, because you can't give enough tours to pay the rent. Because you can barter a lot of things, but we need water and you need electricity. Mm-hmm. Those things they want cash for.
Yeah.
So he said, yeah, the property was big enough that you could rent it, the property for income, or you could actually have sheep, which was his love. And you could raise and sell sheep. You could sell all of the animal husbandry, but still make money. You could have cattle and make money, or you could lease the property, and that would be a steady inflow of cash. But he also made a large box of cassettes where he would recite teaching on. He gave one to, historic sites. One went to the Clay County Museum, which he was very fond of and had donated money, he and Laura. And then I gave Art Smith the box that he gave me to keep until I found someone I thought was really interested in this project, because he didn't want them lost. He made sure that he didn't just have one set. Only his granddaughters had one set.
Oh, so those are still around.
Those are still around. I gave a set to Art Smith.
Maybe we could digitize those and put them on the internet, just for people to have.
I think it would be amazing, because you could do all sorts of things with that, and you would hear his voice.
Yeah, that's interesting. That could be something really cool to put at the end. Talk about this man and his life, and then at the end, kind of
hear him.
Yeah, hear him. Doing what he loved, teach.
He was a teacher from the beginning to the end. And he said, you can always tell a good teacher, excuse me, that was funny too. One of the days he says, you can always tell a good teacher. And I said, why is that? And he says, because they're poorer than most people. And I said, they're poorer than most people, how's that? And he said, because they're always givers. Mm-hmm. He said, the people that are givers, he said, most people, they basically average out to have the same income. Those that have, they don't give. Those that are givers at heart are always giving. And a teacher is always giving. And he said you can find teachers in every area of work. But a teacher is always providing for someone else. They're always teaching something else. And he would always say to me, and what did you learn today? What new did you learn? Just because you're out of school doesn't mean you shouldn't learn. Yeah. So always think about, what did you learn from someone today? Even the smallest thing. You should always grow and always learn.
Yeah, that's interesting that he wanted to kind of build. That's interesting. He kind of wanted people to remember the foundation on which they were standing.
Yes.
He was always sitting there, just keeping things for the younger generations. Yeah, that's all interesting.
And see, now we're doing farming is computers, and we have corporate farming, and their machinery today costs more than most people's houses. Mm-hmm. But back when he was, you were just the 2-row plow or 4-row plow. He was really and he always was trying to figure out, because it wasn't what he wasn't looking for weren't donations for him personally. They were donations for the future. They were donations that he would look for and finagle away to get people to do things for the event that this was going to be a historic site, a teaching facility. It was always meant to be a teaching facility.
So I kind of want Pharis Farm to be like the Disney World of Missouri, except farming
Yeah, he wanted it to be to teach agriculture and to go back to the basics. And now actually society has done that. They've gone back. There's a lot of people that have gone back to the basics. Mm-hmm. We're now back to gardens. We're back to organic. Mm-hmm. And it has cycled back again to that beginning. And he said there's so many lessons from that beginning. So that would have been a man before his time, to think about organic planting and gardens and how you would grow that and how you would eat that and how you would process that.
And nowadays they're making like burgers out of like soy that like taste and like act just like meat. So that's interesting. How he kind of like saw that was going to be a thing.
Yeah. And he thought the property, because of the ambience of the property, you could always have music events, you could always have festivities, he would tell me all the things that Easter egg hunts. He had always had a list of different events because it should be a destination. Because where it wasn't going to be a place where somebody was just going to drive by and say, oh, I think I'll stop at the Pharis Farm today. He thought we should host Farm Bureau. We should support Missouri Ag. All these different things. He says they travel and have meetings. So you want them to come to the fair. So you invite them up here for a meeting up here. You ask for a farm day up here. Whether it's a new machinery, he said you always read. So if there's a new lawnmower out there, contact that guy and tell him that this is a perfect place to try show off their lawnmower. Yeah. And we could have a crowd out here. We've got all, and tell him all the benefits, and he would list the benefits and weigh it. And he said, and then at the end, always tell them they need to provide free lunch so they get a good crowd.
So always bring that free lunch.
Always bring the free lunch, because anytime you have free lunch, people will show up. Mm-hmm. But he looked at making, pulling different entities together and making them, even though they were segmented, making a unit of them, and so that they could actually, everybody would come out a winner. Everybody would benefit from the event.
Mm-hmm. Huh. Well, is there any last things you want to tell, say before we end this?
He was just a very unique, and the man I knew was in his last years. And I've heard people say, oh, well, that's not the man I know, or I know something different. All I can tell you is about the man I knew. Yeah. And he would call me. We probably were 7 days a week. I was probably out there 5. Mm-hmm. We'd take the kids out, and or whatever. If it was after the work day, he was always stronger and brighter in the morning, because his mind was really working hard. But he was probably one of the most focused men, because this was his passion. This was his life's work, to do this and to be a teacher. Yeah. And he said we just had to find teachers to understand his vision. He was a very interesting man, very interesting gentleman. And so at the end, he had even arranged to have a board. Howard Death was one of his neighbors that Donald got to be part of his vision. Mm-hmm. He collected people like most people collect stamps or rocks or whatever. He collected people who could be added to the next piece of his puzzle so that he could accomplish his dream, his passion.
Really hope that didn't pick up.
He was quite an interesting gentleman. Yeah, I knew him in his older age, so he only had that little corner of his that he could see, so he's always tilting his head sideways. But it was amazing the mind he had. The fact you could read him, I was always amazed to him the fact that you could read him a bill and then he could recite it back to you. Yeah. Or his bank statement came one day, and he said, "Now read it to me." And I'm thinking, really? Yeah. And I read it to him, and then he'd sit there and go, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, now this is what it says, and he read it back to me, from his mind. Yeah. And he got his electric bill, and he thought his electric bill was too high. He says, "Go around and make sure everything is turned off and unplugged." He was just quite the character. Yeah, he liked to walk around. He liked to tell you about he knew all of his sheep. His barn he had repaired it was an old barn when I was there. I looked up at one rafter one time we were in there, and I said, Mr. Pharis? And he said, yeah, and he goes, I think that beam's tied together with baling wire. And he goes, yep, that'd be about right. And I said, that looks like a main support beam. There we got. And the wind was blowing pretty good, and he goes, yeah. He says, but it's stayed together all this time, so I expect it to be here tomorrow. And I said, I think we'll talk outside.
Hasn't fallen yet.
It hadn't fallen yet.
Why,
but he always, anytime you were there, too, you always had to go check the sheep. And every now and then he'd get you out there, and he had help sort sheep or something else. He could get a little extra job out of everybody that he could. But he knew what every historic site was doing. He would talk to people. So he would tell me what the James Farm was doing, or Mount Gilead was doing, or what Watkins Mill was doing, or what Claybrook House was doing. And he said, well, I got this idea and this idea. Those are good ideas. We need to incorporate those here at the Pharis Farm. Mm-hmm. But it was always about teaching. He had a pond down there. He'd looked into getting it stocked and what it would take to have the Missouri Conservation come up and have a fish day, teaching kids how to fish. He looked at lots of different organizations that would benefit by that property and make it a teaching from everybody. So it was a win-win for everybody. But his vision of $200,000 was a small endowment in the endowment business. But for him, that was $1 million because he was able to live in Pinchy's Pennies.
That was all he needed.
Yep. He was quite the interesting gentleman.
All right, well, before I go bother Smith, I know I'm probably gonna need this. Could you introduce yourself to the camera just so that we have that in case we want to do that?
Okay.
I mean, I don't know if he's already have you done it,
No.
but I know that he just turned on the camera before he left, and I don't want to just have your little name down there. I'd rather introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is Gieselle Fest. I was Historic Sites Director for Clay County prior to Mr. Pharis's passing. And he collected me to help him achieve his goal.
Like a Pokemon.
Pretty much. He was quite the interesting, and he would hear something on the radio or something. Radio is where he really loved because he couldn't see. He'd have you read the paper to him. He loved the Kansas City paper, but it became difficult when he couldn't read because he couldn't see with this little corner.
Yeah.
But he would hear something, and then he would kind of make a mental note. Oh, we could use that concept to draw more people.
He was just really, he was very focused on just
Very
getting as many
focused.
people as he could there.
Yeah. Whether it was changing the driveway or when he decided that the county would have difficulty with bids, and the county did. He said, well, I've done some checking. The county has trouble paying their bills, and nobody wants to work with the county, which at that time was true. He said, so he arranged with Mr. Mose to come out and install a new furnace. Mm-hmm. And then he decided, well, he checked into it. And security was a big issue. There was Missouri City, there had been some robberies and around. And Pharis property is out there quite a ways.
Is it by Missouri City?
It's north of Missouri City. It's south of what used to be Liberty Hills Country Club. It's a ways from a lot of people. So he decided he'd done some checking. And also that he found the more prosperous historic sites had security systems. So then he had bids and had different guys come out there and give him a bid, tell him what they were going to do for security systems, what they had to offer, and he ended up and then put a security system in the facility so that it would be all ready for when the county took it over. So all the things that he had would be safe. Now he had one larger room upstairs, and there were shelves, and it was just stocked with all sorts of various artifacts.
Yeah.
He had not cataloged.
At all.
No, which was surprising of all the things he did. You would have probably expected everything to be cataloged, but it really wasn't. I think that got to do it because it got down to his site.
Yeah. At the end, it was just a big collection of things.
Very large collection. It was hard to tell what was up there.
There's rusty saw from 1800, and there's a nail. It's like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
He was a very interesting gentleman, and I was very, it was my pleasure to know him. And he was always, there was always a good story for Mr. Pharis. Always a good story. But he was a passionate teacher. Mr. Pharis, his goal and passion in life was teaching, was educating, whether when he was a VOAG teacher to when he was out there, even at 96, he was still wanting everybody, he wanted them to go away learning something. Yeah. What did you learn today?
I learned that there's a lot of stuff I don't know about Liberty's history, like history around Missouri, I had no idea about any of this, like this should definitely be something that's taught about,
He was pretty remarkable and very focused. For someone to start as a young man being a teacher and his whole life be that passion was pretty amazing that somebody could, you have different times that you have different interests, different hobbies. And about every 5 years, your priorities change.
Not him.
But not him. He had that priority. He just had to find somebody to share that priority, and I'm hopeful that the Friends of the Pharis Farm will be that entity that will be sharing his passion and his dream.
Yeah. Huh.
He was very, very interesting. Yeah. To be that kind of gentleman. And he was a man of his time, because at 96, that thing, he was quite amusing. Some of the different comments he'd make about women. We'd explain to him, well, times have changed a little bit. It's okay for women to go to work.
We can vote now. Like you don't
we
have to
can
work.
vote now, and we can go to work.
He's like, are you sure though?
Yeah. But he did. He collected. He was a very unique individual. And people say, well, that's not the man I knew. And I said, but when did you know him? Well, I knew him 10 or 15 years before I knew him. I knew him at the end where he knew his time was getting shorter and shorter. And his time did run out.
Wow.
And his ashes are still out there. Because at the end, he really had a son that, as I understand, a son that lived considerable distance. He was an adopted son. And then Laura had these granddaughters that were there. But when it came time to after he passed on, I got his ashes.
Interesting.
Oh, well, Mr. Pharis and I were friends, but that I'm not sure I'm comfortable with.
Yeah.
But his goal was he had lived and breathed that farm, the whole concept. So actually, we put him in the cedar, and he is out there on the farm. He's forever part of the Pharis Farm.
Wow, that's interesting.
Mr. Neff did that.
It's funny. He was just like, this person I knew. Here you go. Take care of me.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So he always wanted to teach, and he took a lot of his own money, or he was able to get somebody to part with theirs.
He was always able to find money.
Yeah, money was always the issue, but he was always able to really work at getting that. And he said, just like teachers do today, they're always helping fund education in one way or the other, funding their students in one way or the other. And that was what he was. He would talk about his students that he had as a VOAG teacher, and he continued that. He had a lot of all the students from Liberty. He would bring Liberty students out, Missouri City students out, Excelsior Springs students out to the farm so they could see the farm.
I actually remember my principal at Missouri City, because I used to go to Missouri City, Jay Jackson.
Oh, Jay's wonderful.
Yeah, well, he sadly passed on in
He
October,
has.
which is, I didn't even know about that, but I talked to him in January of last year, because I actually did a documentary of Missouri City last year.
Oh.
And I remember one of the things he talked about that I just kind of left out because I didn't think it was worth talking about was the Pharis Farm. I hope I can still find that footage somewhere. But yeah, he said how the farm really inspired him, and how Mr. Donald was, one guy who got him into teaching. And it's I thought that was pretty interesting that, he, this man who was a teacher like 100 years ago, taught this other guy to teach, and then he went on to teach me and a whole bunch of others, and then they're probably going to go on to. It's interesting just how that all works out,
I would say that Mr. Pharis probably, he was so passionate, so driven, but his was on teaching. And I think he's probably inspired a lot of people to teaching. And there's a lot of people that I am sure today, I have to think every now and then something will come up, and then I laugh. I can almost hear his voice in my head say, "And what did you learn today?" Remember, you should learn something new every day, at night, at the end of the day. What did you learn?
I just quickly Google up a quick fact. Diet Coke sinks faster than regular Coke.
And he said it didn't matter as long as you were learning. You were never too old to learn. And he was a teacher. He really was a teacher.
Well, cool.
I was privileged to know him. And, yeah, he was pretty funny, but he was in his own right. He was an older gentleman, so he was from a different time.
Mm-hmm.
But he was always thinking about preserving that property and teaching. How can he teach? Because his teaching never goes out of style. You just have to adapt.
Yeah.
Our culture never goes out of style because we always eat. It just changes. But now we're getting that back. We're talking about people that are looking at living off the land again, doing their own gardening. The pandemic actually has increased that.
Oh, yeah.
Working in the soil, backyard gardening, preserving food, many of the things that he talked about.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting how farming's kind of come back up in recent. Farming's always around, but with the pandemic recently, it's really just interesting how places are. People are just not going out. They're gardening their own food. They're doing this or doing that. With their hands again. Which that's always been around, but now it's a widely popular thing. It's really
a new trend to put your hands back in the dirt, your life in the dirt.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just really interesting how it all kind of comes around.
It is, and many things. He would sit outside, and they would sit and talk to kids. He loved teaching. You talk about bringing kids to the farm. He would just light up. He loved to be a teacher. It was his goal, and this was his legacy, is to continue. Just because he's not here, he wants his dream and his passion to continue. And some of his stories may be just stories, but the goal was to encourage more people to be a better teacher. And a lot of people are a better teacher.
Yeah. I mean, I knew people who are better teachers, people who are like that. I don't know. It's interesting. I like it. Well, here, let me go try to find Smith real quick just so that I don't know how to turn off that camera.
Okay. I guess, you don't have any more questions for me? Think about it.
Was Jeffrey Epstein murdered?
No, I don't know about Jeffrey.
No. I guess he's just somewhere. I don't know how to work this. I guess I'll just stay on for now.
He was pretty funny. First time out, he says, "Well, I've checked up on you." And I said, "Oh, yeah, you have." And he says, "Yeah." He says, "You're a farm girl," and he says, "You come from Iowa." And he really had. I mean, he had checked up on. He gave my resume to me, and who I was married to, who my in-laws were, and
He really knew. He knew everyone before they knew him.
And first time when he did that, I thought, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. But later, that was his scenario. He did that with everybody. So that was his credit check. You had to pass his credit check on whether you were part of his vision, whether he thought you were worthy of sharing his vision.
Well, yeah. I know, that's all interesting. I think we got everything. I don't know what to do now.
Do you have no?
Nope, I ain't got nothing.
Ain't got nothing.
I ain't got nothing.
He was quite the character. Okay, you done?
I don't know.
Well, it's very nice to meet you.
history behind a lot of things until you really dig down deep in there.
Yeah, and he would probably be that one, and same way with that property. So if you could find, I know I gave him to Art Smith, the cassettes, and I gave him a box of different things. And that was another thing that Mr. Pharis did. He gave me, he says, now this box is for historic sites, this one is for the museum. I don't know if he had one for the archives. He gave one to the granddaughters, and he had them professionally copied. And he told me, he says, now don't leave them all in one place, because he had checked that out too on historical libraries and how things disappear or evaporated. He said this way, when you had them in different places, one copy at least should survive.
Yeah.